Recently, I decided to check up on a content creator I've had particular issues with over the past number of years, that being Atun Shei Films. He has recently released a video with his rather typical amateurish acting and recruited a few friends to assist him in this endeavor. Upon watching this video, I rolled my eyes at it. After all, it was an amateurish production, typical of his style. So you may be asking yourself, what are you looking why are you looking into this content if you think lowly of the content produced? My reasoning for wanting to discuss this topic is quite simple. The content of it is a reflection of the viewpoint he and his fan base have upon these historic figures and, by extension, the men who fought for the Confederacy during the American Civil War. This might prompt another question. What relevance does this have to your typical content, and why are you concerned by this? This is best answered by exploring the content as well as initial reactions by his fans when teasing this video. We will start by going into the general plot of the video and analyzing the specific details involved to better understand what exactly he is trying to leave within his audience's minds. The video starts off with two of his characters, a stereotype of a MAGA Trump crowd character and an SS officer, who end up going to a cemetery. More specifically, it is a crypt that, conveniently enough, has many of the Confederate generals and leaders, including, but not limited to, George Armistead, Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and, central to the crypt, Jefferson Davis. When both are in the center of the crypt, the SS officer, whose name is Klaus, murders our MAGA caricature in order to conduct some form of blood ritual to bring back these dead Confederate leaders, most of whom are nothing more than skeletal remains reanimated. However, the final one to emerge is that of a zombie, Jefferson Davis, who speaks to Officer Klaus before the clip ends. Firstly, I wish to start with the caricatures. Caricatures such as that of our MAGA stereotype are commonplace within his content. They seem quite alluring and convincing upon first impression. However, the truth behind these caricatures is that they are strawmen. They exist to make false equivalencies between groups he seeks to equivocate and to discredit their positions through this equivocation. This is a common trademark of his content, which we see with the main caricatures he often uses in the form of Billy Yank and Johnny Reb. The latter, in particular, exists to present particular arguments devoid of context and reasoning in order to dispute them with whatever information he can present without any alternative information being presented. This is otherwise known as a straw man or strawmanning. The MAGA caricature is particularly insulting as he is using this caricature to infer a direct correlation between the America First movement and that of Nazism. It exists to draw a particular false parallel between the two to reinforce Atun Shei's political position to himself and his audience. This is typical of his style. However, what prompted this video is the content centralized on these Confederate dead and his fan base's expressed desire to do unspeakable things to the final resting places of such men. Prior to the release of the aforementioned video, Atun Shei teased it through his community posts, showing some images from the latest video. One showed an image of the video's example of Jefferson Davis's grave, which viewers responded to in various ways. However, one common example that had caught my attention were those that were alluding to or openly stating that it should be urinated on in some fashion, even a couple giving crude examples that would help damage said grave even further. Now you might be asking yourself, well, these are obviously jokes. There can't be much harm behind this, right? to this, all I need to refer to is what happened in 2020 in Richmond, Virginia, where monuments to Confederate generals were desecrated in some fashion, or in the case of Williams Carter Wickham's monument in Monroe Park, were torn down, vandalized, and then urinated upon. These are not jokes. They are thinly veiled expressions of intent masquerading as jokes. This is what many of his fans desire to do, whether they wish to fully admit it or not. The only thing preventing them from doing so is the fear of public backlash or getting caught in the act. A part of what motivates this desire to commit such acts of desecration is, in part, the content produced by amateurs like Atun Shei. Those who don't know better will take the information presented to them by people like Atun Shei as absolute gospel, rather than actively questioning whatever information they are given and seeking to find alternative viewpoints. This is only made worse when few are willing to speak out against such matters, or when they are willing, they are shut down either by the mob mentality or by the powers that be, who do not wish for an alternative viewpoint to be made manifest. This brings us to the video and its content. What it does is feed into the problem by doing two specific things. One directly ties in Nazism with the Confederacy, and two, dehumanizes these Southern leaders by portraying them as nothing more than the undead controlled by Klaus. The first example is apparent enough. It makes the same exact error that many novice people make concerning anything that does not fit the modern orthodoxy. Label it as some form of evil by drawing a false equivalency towards Nazism. It does not take a genius to figure out that Nazism and the Confederacy are not the same, having entirely different forms of government, having completely different ideological beliefs, and so on and so forth. However, it is a common trend among modernists and postmodernist ideologues to make a comparison to Nazism and at every turn, even if it does not make much sense to do so. The reasoning for this, though, is quite simple. It condemns ideas that contradict modernism and postmodernism as the most evil thing imaginable to the postmodernist, i.e., Nazism. It is through this form of damnatio cognitationis that they can freely shut down completely different avenues of thought from the common man who has been ingrained with this same viewpoint. By even having a few similarities to the most evil ideology imaginable to modern man, it condemns the entire thing outright. At least this is what they believe in. The second example is a bit more subtle, yet is still there. It is the dehumanization of these men by having them be nothing more than the undead henchmen of Klaus. The concept of the undead is something that has been overdone, of course, but the issue is the fact that all of these people are real people who have easily identifiable burial locations that most anyone can visit. By portraying them as nothing more than undead servants of an SS officer, you lose a bit of their humanity. It is important that we remember that these were, and still are, people who lived. They all had mothers and fathers who tended to them. They had wives that they loved dearly. They had children who they loved and who loved them in turn. And last, but not least, they experienced sorrow and pain just as we do. Let's take Jefferson Davis as an example. His first wife, Sarah Knox Taylor Davis, died upon her contracting malaria after they'd only been wed for 3 months. His second wife, Verena Davis, would go on to have many kids with them, but out of the 6 children they had, only 2 of their children would make it into adulthood. One of their children, Joseph Evan Davis, would die a tragic death after he fell from the upper story balcony of their home in Richmond, Virginia in 1864. and he died at the age of 5. Jefferson Davis's life was marred by tragedy, paralleling that of Abraham Lincoln's life. In the end, Jefferson Davis would be buried in Hollywood Cemetery after initially being buried in New Orleans' Metairie Cemetery, after along with the children he outlived, and would later be accompanied by his wife and his 2 daughters who outlived him. These were human beings, men who felt all the emotions we feel in our daily lives. Yet they experienced greater tragedy than many of us could not hope to have imagined. Experienced immense pain and suffering we couldn't hope to dream of in our lifetimes. To dehumanize the tangible suffering and pain these men felt is a disservice to those who came before us, a crime against those who lived before us. Whether Atun Shei did this out of a few chuckles or not is not the issue I take up with. What I take issue with is the lack of responsibility of his own part to show some sense of responsibility for his own actions. He may not be responsible for everything his fans might say or do, but he is responsible for holding himself accountable for the actions he takes or the viewpoints he expresses, for it is that which the fans derive their views from. If any harm comes to these resting places, if any wrongdoing takes place where these men lie, then I know that Atun Shei is, in part, responsible for what has taken place.